Hey folks, so today we're going to discuss right concentration. That's the 8th stage along the Eightfold Path, the last one. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm the study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in trying to help promote a wiser, a kinder, and a less stressed out world, consider subscribing to the channel. It won't cost you anything, and we'll have videos out like this roughly once a week on Mondays, and maybe some extras now and then. So consider it. So right concentration. What does the Buddha mean in the early texts about right concentration? The best way to describe that is, in the text he talks about the 4 what are called jhanas. Jhanas are states of deep concentration, of absorptive concentration, the kind of state that we might at least think about having achieved when, let's say, we're deep in some kind of work or deep in some kind of sport, and the world seems to drop away around us. It's the kind of state that we achieve after many, many hours of meditation over many, many days. These are difficult states to achieve, certainly for those of us, myself included, who may have a daily or even not even daily meditation practice. If we only do, say, 30 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, we're not going to really be able to achieve these kinds of states. Now, the Buddha, in the text, in the Pali Canon, speaks very little about his youth. Most of the stories we know about the Buddha's youth are largely apocryphal, coming from the later tradition, made-up stories. But the Buddha does say one thing, which is that when he was a child, he was able to achieve the first jhana, which we will discuss in a moment, while sitting underneath a rose apple tree. And he seems to have discovered this or reached this almost without intending to, perhaps without intending to at all. And then it seems to have fallen out of his memory, but later on, during his career trying to find awakening, after he had undergone a number of great austerities, basically trying to follow the paths of the other teachers around him. Some of the teachers seem to have been Jains from what's called the Jain religion, who believe that austerities, denying ourselves food, undergoing types of pain, burn off our bad karma and burn off our tendency towards wanting sense desires, sense pleasures. So the Buddha underwent these austerities and claims to have done them as well as anybody, or better than anybody, finding at the end that they seemed not to lead him to awakening. They didn't seem to get him where he wanted to go. After leaving that behind and sort of in a state of you might say in a state of sadness or a state of depression or whatever, recalled that early experience with the first jhana underneath the rose apple tree. And when he recalled it as a state that was pure. It was a kind of pleasure that was pure, that was not tainted by sense desire, because it's not a sensory pleasure. It's a pleasure simply arising out of meditation. So as the story goes, after remembering that state, he then went and achieved these 4 jhanas, discovered these 4 jhanas, achieved them. It's not entirely clear whether they existed before him or whether he invented them, discovered them. Nevertheless, he went and achieved these 4 jhanas that we will discuss in a moment. And after that, awakening occurred underneath the Bodhi tree. So this is at the very, very end, just before he achieves awakening. So what are the 4 jhanas? Okay, so the first jhana, let's start with the first, is what they call sort of a rapture and a pleasure born of seclusion. So basically what happens is that in meditation, after long periods of meditation, you achieve periods that are without the so-called 5 hindrances, which I've discussed in a prior video. I can put a link up here somewhere. 5 hindrances are getting caught up in ill will, anger, getting caught up in greed, desire, getting tired, sleepy, having the monkey mind, the mind going everywhere, and doubt. And once those 5 hindrances drop away for periods of time, long periods of time perhaps, which there's just by itself seems to arise a kind of a rapture, a kind of bubbling pleasure and bliss. And that is what the first jhana is. And there is some, he says in the text that it's associated with a certain kinds of mental states. There is some disagreement, I think, over exactly what that means. Some people take this to mean basically that the first jhana is achieved while we're still thinking a little bit in the background. We may have some discursive thought going on in a sort of a low level. Others think that that doesn't happen, but we can leave that aside for now. The Buddha also gives similes about all of these 4 jhanas. The simile for the first jhana is that it's like somebody kneading together bath powder, which is sort of like soap, basically, and it comes in flakes. You knead it together in water, and what you end up is with a ball that is permeated and soaked with water. And so in the same way, to achieve the first jhana seems to be an active process, kneading together the mind, and that when we're done, the rapture and bliss and pleasure that we experience sort of permeates the mind and the body. In the second jhana, it's said that it seems as though thought drops away. Exactly how one interprets that depends on the person doing the interpreting, but in any event, the thought drops away. And what we're left with is a simple rapture and pleasure. It's a little bit lower kind of rapture, but it's a sort of still a bubbling rapture and a pleasure. But here it's rapture and pleasure born of concentration, rather than in the first jhana, say, born of seclusion. In the first jhana, again, you're secluded from the world, just doing the meditation. In the second jhana, the mind is more unified and sort of concentrated on this state in front of it, the state of rapture and pleasure. And here the simile is of a lake, a sort of a mountain lake we can imagine, that the source of the lake is a cool spring that cool water wells up from beneath. Again, it's in this simile, the cool water permeates the lake in the same way that the rapture and pleasure permeates the body and the mind, but there isn't a sense of activity here. It's this kind of quiet welling up from within. In the third jhana, there's no rapture. The rapture, that's kind of bubbling experience, drops away, and we're left simply with the pleasure. So this is even more calm than the first two, because the first two had this kind of effervescent quality to them that drops away in the third jhana, that's quieter. And here the simile is of lotuses that are growing up underneath the water of a pond, and that are permeated from their root to their tip by water. So again, in this simile, the idea is that this pleasure just sort of permeates the body, and becomes a bodily pleasure that extends from the top of our head to the tip of our toes. That's the experience. And in the fourth jhana, the pleasure itself drops away, and what we're left with is equanimity, is this kind of a state of pure equanimity, which in the Buddhist thinking is a higher state of pleasure. It's not bodily pleasure, but it's a kind of mental pleasure. It's called a happy dwelling happily in this very life. That is sort of the point of the fourth jhana, is to achieve a state of a pure state of happiness that is not bodily pleasure, but is just simple equanimity. And here the simile he gives is as though we're seated in meditation, covered in a white cloth. The equanimity, this kind of pure awareness, is sort of like the light filtering through the white cloth at us. So the fourth is the last jhana, and in certain texts he goes from that last jhana to a state of insight, and then from that state or that state then constitutes his awakening, at least in some of the texts. Now, I mean, if you're interested in reading more about jhana and learning more about jhana, I would recommend highly Lee Brasington's book, Right Concentration. Lee was one of my teachers. I took a course with him several years ago. An excellent teacher, extremely clear and concise. Gives very, very good instruction on what you should do in meditation if you want to try to achieve these kinds of states. Lee's approach is somewhat controversial in one sense, that he believes that there is a distinction between the jhanas achieved in the early texts and the jhana achieved in some of the later texts, such as the Visuddhimagga, which is a 5th century of a Common Era text. He believes that in the early texts, the jhanas were lighter. They were easier to achieve. They didn't take quite as much effort. They may have involved some thought, at least at the early stages. That the later texts, the jhanas are deeper, are harder to achieve, involve more bells and whistles, and so on. That's his view. There are other views. Probably one of the greatest scholars of the early tradition, Analayo, believes something quite different. He believes that in the early texts, the jhanas were just as deep, as far as I can tell, just as deep as in the later texts. But this is at least to give you some idea that there is some controversy, some difference of opinion about what exactly is a jhana, how do we tell if we've achieved one? But at least, if we know that there are deeper states available to us, at least that might give us a spur to look for them. So I'd be interested to know, what do you guys think? What do you guys pursue jhanic types of states? Or are they things that you think are not of interest to you, or that they take too much time, too much effort? But I'd be interested to know what you guys think and what your experience has been. So that's a nutshell approach to the last of the Eightfold Path. And again, I want to emphasize, this is the one that the Buddha ends up with. He ends up with, if you like, the fourth jhana. I mean, that's really the end of the Eightfold Path. Equanimity. That's also the seventh of the factors of awakening. Equanimity. Equanimity comes in at the end of many of these early lists when we're getting towards awakening. Equanimity is extremely important, because that is where we put ourselves between disliking things and attaching ourselves to things. So I think even if we don't look at jhana as something that we can achieve ourselves or necessarily want to, we should at least keep in mind that really the end of the path is a kind of equanimous state. So hope that was useful to you. I hope that this path through the Eightfold Path has been helpful. If you're interested in these kinds of topics, again, consider subscribing. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm really glad to have you here. Take a look at some of the other videos on the channel, see if you like them. If you've been here before, then welcome back. Glad to have you back. So anyway, we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.